That's what we're doing this year. So today we are going to do a few things. We're gonna start off with a Kahoot, because Kahoot. And then we're going to finish the last few slides from session 1 and talk about the blood-brain barrier and neurotransmitters. And along with that, I'm going to talk about an upcoming assignment. Then we're going to talk about the sensory system basics. And then I'll leave y'all some time to do a blog post on something related to that. Any questions, comments, jokes, announcements before we start? One day somebody's going to come to class with a joke. Okay, so let's start with the Kahoot. If I minimize this, I'm going to try to do better on this today. All right, can you guys see the Kahoot coming up? Yes, I see Tylen nodding. Okay, here we go. 864-3869. All right, here we go. Session 2. You'll see some retrieval practice here. Which aspect of the brain includes the cerebral cortex, where higher order thinking occurs? Okay, so I'm glad that one was in here because I want it to be retrieved correctly. So that's the gray matter. Now, some higher order thinking does occur in the cerebellum, but that's not the best answer. That one's in there as what we call a distractor. So make sure you are familiar with that stuff. You may want to make flashcards or make a list and leave a column blank, something that you're doing as we learn these new terms that makes you retrieve it. So please don't just re-listen to the lecture or look at the slides or look at your notes. You need to do something to pull it out to really learn it. True or false? There are 2 major components of the human nervous system. It is true. And that picture was kind of a sort of a clue, but it's not necessarily the, well, the brain and spinal cord are part of the central nervous system, but the overall human nervous system is the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So either way you slice it, there are 2 components of it. Multi-select, more than one right answer. What's included in the central nervous system? I might have just said that. So most people, it confused me there why there were so many answers. I forgot that's how it looks. Most people got it right. It is the central nervous system is the spinal cord and the brain. That's very, very, very important for you to mostly because that is why it's much harder, and sometimes really at this point in our scientific discovery and knowledge, impossible for recovery, or much harder when the injuries or illness or whatever condition that affects the spinal cord and the brain, because the central nervous system is much less able to repair itself. Though we do have neuroplasticity, which we're going to talk about a little bit more today. Which hemisphere interprets abstract or creative input? Is that left or right? Which side of the brain is your creative one? It's the right side. So remember, we talked about the fact that there's kind of a, I don't know if it's a myth, but there's kind of a belief out there that left-handed people are more creative in general. And so if you remember that myth, you can remember that even though that doesn't always apply, it does link to the left-hand side of the body to the right side of the brain. Which hemisphere plays a bigger role in language? Left. Left language. Which hemisphere controls left-sided movement of the body? All right, so this is really, really important. The left side movements come from the right side of the brain, and you have to know that. This is so, so important. The reason being is if something happens to the right side of your brain, it's going to more affect your left side movement and sensation, and vice versa. So you need to know that, not just in this class, forevermore. And when I say some part of the brain controls something, I'm not saying that nothing else in the brain is involved in whatever we're talking about, but what's primarily controlling it. Brain power's got a streak going for sure. Which lobe of the brain is most closely related to impulse control? Good. Most people got it. This is very important as well. All right. So I'm going to take off my professional hat and tell you just for a second how I started remembering impulse control goes with the frontal lobe. When I was an OT student, is one of my classmates pointed out that it's an F word, the frontal lobe, right? There's another F word that you and I both know about, and it's not feminism. That comes out of people's mouths a lot when they have a frontal lobe injury. So now I bet you will remember it. So you can, parietal is more perceptual and temporal is time. So, get some kind of a trick that helps you remember. And then you can remember, because it's not like it just does that one thing, it does other things, but something that it is really known for, you can remember that. So frontal lobe, F word, impulse control. Now I'll put my hat back on. What part of the brain is responsible for regulation of breathing? Like when you're asleep, you don't think, take a breath, take a breath. It's the brainstem. Yes. So remember that brainstem, right? In this area, that's what controls, it connects down to the spinal cord. So you can think, it's really sort of like the stem or the almost the root of a plant. And then the roots go further down, but it's like the top of the root that goes into the plant. So it's the basics. It's swallowing, breathing, heart rate, pulse, very basic stuff. Brainstem basic. Seth has a brain tumor that's impacting his balance. Where do you think the tumor is? He's walking around like he's drunk. Our best guess would be cerebellum. Yep. So my little goofy trick to remember that is that I notice when I look at that word, there are two L's that, are parallel. Of course, they're right there. So that makes me think of a balance beam. Like if you laid it flat or something somebody has to walk on. So if they lose their balance, it's going to be problematic. Cerebellum balance. Last one, true or false? After age 25, no neural connections, no new neural connections form in the brain. That is false. I randomly made up that number, 25. I mean, I just chose it out of the air. Never in life can we say that no new neural connections can be made. There's always the potential, it gets less, that's going to happen less likely and take more time to do it as we age. But you can be 109 and learn a new skill. So think about it that way. All right, lots of good learning in this Kahoot. I think you may see some of these questions again. The link is available to you for practice in the folder for today's course content. Brain power. All right, so let's go back to the slides and let's talk about something that we didn't talk about on Wednesday, but it's a brain basic, something called neurotransmitters. Now, I hope you guys have heard this word before, but you may or may not have. It's something that's very important, almost kind of like the Freon in an air conditioning system is. It's there. We don't think about it a lot unless it's malfunctioning. If there's too much or too little, something's probably going to be going wrong, and then we'll notice. But otherwise, we just kind of expect all that to work and to allow us to do whatever we want to do, right? So there are a bunch of chemicals in the brain. It's not just structures and vessels, white matter, gray matter. There are chemicals in there. And there's a lot of chemicals in there, and we call those, because they're in the brain, we call them neuro. And because their main function is to make some kind of a neurological message transmit, we call them neurotransmitters. So we are going to talk about that. They regulate a lot of what we do and say, how we act, how we interact, a lot of our behavior. They can be excitatory, meaning they make you more alert, excited, maybe even nervous, anxious, or inhibitory, meaning they slow things down. They make you more chill or let you go to sleep or keep you from worrying as much. Excitatory can just be like a boost of feel good stuff too. So every neurotransmitter can be excitatory or inhibitory, or they may have both functions depending on what else is going on chemically in the brain. So let's talk about the neuroassignment project. So if you look under assignments, the very first one you'll see is the neurotransmitter project. Now, there's a relatively quick turnaround time on this, but my guess would be this project will take you probably maybe 2 hours to do, maybe less. I mean, you can think about it and, you make yourself get stuck, I guess, and it might take you longer, but I don't think it's going to take you like an all day thing is what I'm saying. So here's what the assignment is. Now I have instructions on here that you can look at. That's going to tell you what to do, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Well, okay, hold on. I will, let's go over that. So each of you has been assigned to one of the 8, there are many more than 8, but one of the 8 primary neurotransmitters. And so here's the assignment, and you can download that form, and it shows you, also on that form is the report template. This is an individual project. All right, let me share my screen. So here's what the project is. It's an opportunity to use one or more evidence-based sources. So don't go on Wikipedia or mydogspot.com or anything. It needs to be a reputable resource to locate facts about a neurotransmitter. And so you're going to do some research on it, dig into it so that you can fill in this grid here. What makes it up? What does it do? Where does it get produced? All those, these things, find that out through a reputable source. And then based on that, create something original that represents that neurotransmitter, the one that you're assigned to. So it might be a dance, it might be a song, it might be a poem, a painting. You might make something out of popsicle sticks. It might be a stuffed animal. One time someone crocheted a pot holder, and they made the case of how that relates or helped them understand the neurotransmitter to which they were assigned. I will tell you that last year, several students did TikTok. So I'm on TikTok, and I never post, but that I'm on there just because of that. And my handle is OT on the TikTok. There's no minimum or maximum length as long as you cover these things and then talk about why whatever you made relates to the neurotransmitter. So you can't just, blow up a balloon and show that and turn it in. You have to say why that would represent it. And you can go as low or no tech as you want, or you can go as high tech and make a cartoon or a movie or a TikTok or something like that. Or you can draw a picture with a piece of paper and pencil. That is not going to affect your grade. So, how low or high tech you go, do it in a way that you can remember or understand the transmitter better. So here's an example. If I was assigned one that's not on y'all's list, but let's say the neurotransmitter histamine. So it's an amino acid, it's excitatory, right? When you get histamine and let's say you get exposed to pollen, or maybe you're allergic to peanuts or bee stings and you get exposed to that, your body's going to put out histamine. That's excitatory, right? It revs everything up. It's produced really throughout the body, including the brain and the stomach. The reason we have histamine is because it boosts blood flow and helps us recognize when something's like an invader. Who discovered it? What happens if you get too much? You can have an allergic reaction, that kind of thing, gut problems, hives, headaches. If you have too little, you could end up with an elevated dopamine level, and then you might have anxiety. Um, it's associated with certain health conditions like anaphylactic shock or skin allergies. And they're said to be, if just another interesting fact, they're called the bouncers of the club because they help us know when something foreign, like an allergen, has been entered the body. So that's my example. You guys have access to this also. So you can look at that. And I intentionally didn't put one that you all have just so it wouldn't stifle your creativity. All right. So that's your assignment. And you know it's coming up. And we will share these in class. So they're actually due just before class. So you'll submit it. You have to take a picture of it, or if it's a video, or if you created a YouTube or a TikTok, just give me that link. Otherwise, just upload it to Google Docs or something, Google Images, something, so you can submit. Now, if you just draw a picture, you can just submit the picture. But if there is a link, give me the link. Or if you want to write a poem, just submit the poem. So submit whatever you have here by April 28th before class. Usually my deadlines are end of day, but we're going to go over in class that day. And that's worth 50 points. So that, and you turn it in all under the assignments under that folder. All right, let's see. Looks like where should you put your sources? You can upload it on a separate piece of paper, a separate document, or the same one. If you're doing like a video or something, you can just copy and paste that in. So it doesn't really matter to me. I'm just gonna, I would like to see that you've sourced it somewhere, but you know what? Let me take that back. So since what you're doing is filling out that template on the instructions, if you can just type in the sources underneath that template. I'm talking about on this document, just to make sure we're literally on the same page, this one. So just type in under here your sources, okay? And then submit that. And if you have a link or another photo or something else, submit that. So everybody will very likely have two things. All right. Any other questions about that upcoming assignment? Something to put on your calendar, on your radar? It will help you learn about neurotransmitters, but we're going to talk about those a little more today. So let me share that. That's going to be something else that we didn't get to cover on Wednesday. So let's talk about it today. So that's why I have this added in. So we know that the different neurochemicals do different things. You might have heard people talk about a dopamine burst or an adrenaline burst, something like that, or turkey. When I eat the turkey dinner at Thanksgiving, I get that serotonin sleepiness. And all those things are accurate. We need to dig in deeper as to what too much and too little look like, and where it comes from, that sort of thing. So we can understand the brain and how it works better. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is the cranial nerves. Something else important for you to know, and I will go ahead and tell you out of the gate, most of the time people do just have to flat out memorize these. Now, there are several different mnemonics that are already created, or you can create your own that will help you. And I promise you, like, I still remember the one that I originally learned for this, and that was over 30 years ago. And I've heard other people use this same one. The one I use is on old Olympus towering top, a fen viewing German viewed a hop. Why that where that doesn't even really make sense, but somehow it's stuck in my brain. So that's what I hope you guys can do. You can Google other mnemonics or memory devices. And then you just kind of go through, make yourself some flashcards and look at what each of these do. And sometimes I think students think, why would I ever need to know that? Well, there are conditions out there that just, yes, I will, that just impact one or two or sometimes three of these nerves. In fact, I talked to a student yesterday who just, an MOT3, who just finished her level 2 fieldwork. So she's all set to graduate here in a couple weeks. And she was telling me that a clinic, one of the places she did her last field work, that there was a patient that had specific trigeminal nerve palsy. So there was some kind of damage to that nerve, and that whatever it innervated wasn't working right. So I'll tell you how to kind of get into that in just a minute. On old Olympus's that's my mnemonic there. All right, let's watch this little video, and hopefully it'll help you even with a drawing. If you're more visual than auditory, this might work for you better, or give you another idea of what will work.
Grammarly can help you write quickly and confidently, so you never have to slow down at work. Stay on top.
Okay, this is finally the video that I promised. This is the video on the functions of the cranial nerves. Before going forward, keep in mind that this is a very basic review on the functions of the cranial nerves. It is in no way exhaustive of their functions, but this video should give you a basic idea of what these cranial nerves actually do. So let's get started. Some of you have probably seen a picture similar to this to help people remember the functions of the cranial nerves. This is going to be the one that I will be going over, since it is also the picture that I used when I was a student. So let's start drawing this thing. With our blank space, let's start by drawing the number 7. And then again, backwards, let's draw the number 7 again. This, of course, will be the outline of our face. From here, I like to draw in the number 1 as the nose, large 2s as the eyes, and 3s for eyebrows. Next, I like to draw in small 4s at the medial corner of the 2s, and then a very large 5, which will give us part of the mouth and the forehead wrinkle. At this point, I draw in 6 on both sides of the 2s. We could skip 7 here, since that is the first thing we did. So we could skip that and draw in 8s as our ears. This is where it could get a little tricky, but just follow along and I will explain all of this later. So go ahead and draw in a large tongue and put in another 7 here, but make sure the 7 takes up more than half of the front of the tongue. For that, you could draw in a 9 and then a 10 right behind it. And why don't you give our man or woman a tongue ring? This is where we could draw in cranial nerve number 12. Finally, we're left with cranial nerve 11. You could place them here where our person's shoulders are supposed to be. And that's it. Okay, so let's go over this. Cranial nerve 1, the olfactory nerve, is purely a sensory nerve responsible for the sense of smell. That is why we had placed it as our person's nose. Cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, is also purely a sensory nerve. That is responsible for the sense of sight or vision. That is why it is our person's eyes. Cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve, like its name says, is a motor nerve for the eyes and aids in eye movement. But keep in mind that there are other cranial nerves that are also responsible for eye movement, which I will talk about in more detail in another video. But just for the sake of simplicity, just remember that cranial nerve 3 aids in the movement of our eyes. Also, I like where we place our cranial nerve 3 because it helps us remember a few of the other things that cranial nerve 3 does. Because it is above our eyes on our drawing, this reminds us that one of the nerve's functions is in opening our eyelids. And because of its proximity to our eyes, you could probably guess that this nerve has other functions associated with our eyes. These are a little more difficult to remember, but include pupillary constriction and lens accommodation, or in other words, it helps with focusing on things we see at different distances. Remember that I said that there were other cranial nerves responsible for eye movement? Well, let's talk about them now. These other nerves are cranial nerves 4, the trochlear nerve, and cranial nerve 6, abducens. Again, for simplicity's sake, just remember that these nerves are responsible for eye movement. And in summary, they are cranial nerves 3, the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 4, the trochlear nerve, and cranial nerve 6, abducens. Cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve, is our first sensory and motor nerve. And by looking at our drawing, you could guess that it has something to do with the face. And of course, you're right. Cranial nerve 5 is responsible for facial sensation, or what you feel on your face, like pain or soft touch. You could also include the anterior 2/3 of the tongue in this area that cranial nerve 5 innervates as its sensory component. In regards to the motor component of cranial nerve 5, it innervates your muscles of mastication, and so it helps you open and close your jaw and aids in chewing your food. Cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, is also a mixed sensory and motor nerve. Its motor component is responsible for facial expression and facial movement, so things like frowning and smiling are all due to cranial nerve 7. Its sensory component, on the other hand, is responsible for taste on the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. This is why we also have it located on the tongue on our drawing. However, don't confuse this with cranial nerve 5's involvement with somatosensation to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, which is a different type of sense. While we're here talking about the tongue, let's just go ahead and examine it further. Cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve, is both a sensory and motor nerve. Its sensory component is responsible for the sensation at the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. This includes both taste and somatosensation. Note that cranial nerve 10 is also in this area. That's because it's involved in taste as well, but it's actually responsible for taste sensed at the epiglottis. Cranial nerve 10, because it's so far back in the throat on our drawing, also aids in swallowing, but also has functions when we talk and cough. Lastly, on the tongue is cranial nerve 12. I placed it at the tip of our tongue because when a person sticks out their tongue, moves it side to side, you know that cranial nerve 12 is intact because it's responsible for tongue movement. Cranial nerve 8 is literally and figuratively our ears, and it aids in hearing and balance. And finally, cranial nerve 11 we had placed at our person's shoulders because it innervates your trapezius and sternocleidomastoid muscles, which helps with shrugging your shoulders and with turning your head.
All right, that's a pretty neat little helpful memory tool, I guess. So maybe you can practice that if that helps you. And not only do you can use kind of a mnemonic or something to remember the nerves, but then you can use the drawing to remember their function. So I've seen a lot of people have success with that over the years. All right, something else that we need to talk about today is the blood-brain barrier. Sometimes you might see this abbreviated with 3 uppercase B's, so BBB. Not really in medical charts or anything, but just kind of in writing, or sometimes people will say it like that. But what that is, now I said a histamine is like the bouncer at a nightclub, but that's amongst neurochemicals. Structurally and really chemically also, what we think of as the big mean bouncer who's not going to let people in who aren't supposed to be there, and he'll throw them out if they get in somehow and they're not supposed to be there. There's an assembly line of cells in the brain's blood system that only lets certain molecules through. So I kind of think of the blood-brain barrier as cheesecloth. If you guys know what that is, you can envision it. People use it in cooking. You can envision it like sort of like a coffee filter, I guess, or a paper towel. That not everything, some molecules are too big, or think particles like the coffee grounds, they're too big to go through the coffee filter, but water or another type of liquid isn't too big. Or if you even put some kind of flavoring, or I guess you could put your creamer in the coffee filter, and then as if you had powdered creamer, and then it'll liquefy and it can go through that. So that's what that barrier is. It's to protect the brain so that things, and usually the things that are trying to get in there that aren't allowed are usually like poisons, things that, heavy metals, toxins like that. And so it's there for protection. Now, the problem with the blood-brain barrier is it can make it harder for most kinds of chemotherapies and sometimes other medications to get through. So that can be an issue, and why it's harder to treat brain tumors and other things that affect just the brain. It can be trickier. So what causes breakdown in the blood-brain barrier? Sometimes that coffee filter or that bouncer isn't working up to its full potential, what we really need it to be working to. And some things that can cause that over time are hypertension, which is high blood pressure. Okay, it's one thing it can do is break that barrier down, and then you're less protected. Sometimes it's a developmental issue. So the child is born with not the full barrier in place. A high concentration of a substance in the blood, if there's way too much sodium or lead, for example, then that can over time break down that barrier. An infection such as meningitis or encephalitis, we'll talk about those later, but that definitely can. Inflammation is another thing. If you have chronic inflammation, that can cause a breakdown in that. And then last but not least, trauma. Obviously, that can break the barrier down. If you envision it like a coffee filter, it'd be the same as if I jabbed this pen through a coffee filter. So if there's some injury like a stab wound or a bullet wound, and it affects that barrier, that can definitely break it down and make it where it's not doing what it's supposed to. All right, so let's move on to the sensory systems. Let's talk about vision. Some of the main things that I want you to know about this, and this comes really straight from that textbook, or if you had the audio that you listened to, so you might have already filled some of this stuff in on your sheet. 30% of the cerebral cortex is made up of structures that have to do with your vision. So we say that the visual system makes up 30% of the cerebral cortex. That's more than any other sensory system. So think about that. Any ideas as to why that might be? Why did Mother Nature make the brain like that? Anybody want to speak up or put something in the chat? Why is that visual system taking up so much of our brain? Oh, good. Okay, you're thinking very evolutionarily, to look out for predators in the past, or gosh, in this day and age, what about you have to look out for cars that are driving, or we're constantly have our technology all around, or things in our environment. So yes, probably originally the reason was because for your very survival, you need to be able to see and notice when something's coming to get you. So it was kind of the survival of the fittest type thing. And over time, because of neuroplasticity, that it ended up taking up more and more of the brain, but it's pretty stable right now because we're not exactly usually having to look out for, wild boars or grizzly bears coming towards us. 30%. Now, you probably heard the term retina. Maybe you've even studied it a little bit, but just to reiterate, it's what it is. It's a layer at the very back of your eyeball. You could think of it sort of like a movie screen. The cells there are very sensitive to light, and when they get triggered, so the nerves in those cells get triggered, the light passes through the optic nerve into the brain, into the visual cortex, and an image is formed because of associations in the brain. Now, another term is fovea, and that's a little dip or depression in the retina where the visual acuity is the highest. Macula, that's another word. That's the central area of vision. So it's the things around the little dot that's the fovea. And it's of particular interest to people who specialize in retinal function because it's larger, it's the larger part of the retina. And it really is what gives us the ability to see 20/20 or whatever your vision is. That comes from that. It also has to do with the colors that we see, which also, if you think about it, could have something to do with our safety. Depth perception, and if you see a snake, what color is it? So or what pattern is it? You might need to know if it's poisonous or not. So knowing what the macula is, what is macular degeneration? I feel like I hear that on commercials a lot these days. It's a degenerative condition. So it happens, and we don't really know why, but it's not curable. It's when the cells in the retina, especially the macula, start deteriorating, breaking down, and that results in distorted vision, maybe blurriness, and eventually can be total loss of vision. It occurs especially in older adults. And so you might hear it referred to in that case as age-related macular degeneration. It's just something that kind of happens over time to a number of older adults. Photoreceptors, what are those? That's what gives us our color vision and our vision at night. The ability to see with very little light. Those are special receptors in the retina that convert light into signals that go to the brain. Now, it's kind of interesting to think about. There are about 125 million photoreceptors in each eye. So assuming we all have two eyes, we all have 250 million photoreceptors. There are two types of photoreceptors. That number is not really important. Don't spend brain energy memorizing that. It's just know that it's a lot. And there are two types, the rods and cones. Now, I know you probably had that back in third grade science. But to review, a rod it's a photoreceptor. It's in the retina. We know that already. They're sensitive to light levels, and that's what gives us good vision or usable vision in low light. They're concentrated in the very outer area of the retina. And they also help us with peripheral vision because they're so exterior. They help us to see what's going on around us. Now, kind of the partner of the rods are the cones. They're also photoreceptors. They're also in the retina, we know. Cones give us the color vision. Cones color. They're concentrated in the center of the retina in the macula. So remember, if you look at this drawing, this is done with colored pencils. You can see the areas I'm talking about. You can see the macula. You can see with the cones. You can see the fovea, the retina, and you can see the rods. Now, another term you might have heard of is the optic chiasm. That is the place in the front of the brain. So it's really just behind your eyes. If you cut into my brain and went just a little bit back behind my eyes, that's the optic chiasm. And what it is, it looks like an X. You guys might have seen it in gross anatomy, but it's the place where the nerve fibers from your left eye and the nerve fibers from your right eye cross over. And some of them turn and go the other way, and some of them keep along the same way. And so a question that I'm wondering is, what do you think would happen if we didn't have an optic chiasm? If just so in that scenario, the nerves that come from your visual system in your left eye go straight to your visual cortex, on the left side of your brain, and the right eye information goes straight to that on the right. What would happen if that happened with somebody? Any hypotheses?
Would it like keep images from merging together? Like, can I have two separate visions from each eye?
Yes, exactly. So you got the visual of what that chiasm, the X, keep doing that, the X looks like. And the function of it is that, think about this. If you, okay, let's just do it. Close one of your eyes. So like you're winking at somebody, you can still see stuff, even without moving your head, you can still see stuff that's on the other side of your nose. It's not like, you got a blinder on and you can only see stuff over here. You can see it over there too. And that's because of that crossover. And same if you did it with the other eye. So good news is, if you get something in one eye, like you're driving down the road and you get, an eyelash or piece of dog hair or something in your eye, as long as it's not both eyes, you can still see well enough to drive, at least, not in busy traffic, although I might pull over if that happened. So that's the optic chiasm. Now that relates to, and good answer, that relates to binocular vision. That's just what it sounds like. That's not a hard term. It just means bi meaning two, like a bicycle, and ocular meaning eyes. So it's seeing with two eyes. That's what it is. And it's important because it allows us to see things in 3D. Each eye sees things from a slightly different angle. And because of that optic chiasm, that all that information goes in a very complete way to the visual cortex, so the brain can figure out what it is you're looking at. It's also why if you only see half of something, like if you see this and I cover up this, what it is, because what the rest of it looks like. Or if I did this, you'd be like, yeah, that's a pen, even though you didn't see the bottom of it. What happens, kind of the opposite of that binocular vision, is something called strabismus. If you know anybody, or maybe you yourself had this to a certain degree, you might have had surgery on it, or they might have, usually as a younger child, it means crossed eyes. It's when the muscles and or the nerves around the eyes are not functioning well enough to keep them in the midline as they're supposed to be. So they cross over, and so that very much confuses things at the optic chiasm. That scenario reminds me of how the junction of 40 and I-40, kind of almost off of Sam Cooper, and if you're going to Nashville that way, before the repairs a few years ago, for the improvements to that ramp on-off system, it was so jammed up there all the time. It was just a mess. And that's kind of what that would be like if this eye's looking over here and this over here, but then those images are crossing again. The binocular vision is not going to be fully available, or maybe not available at all. So that's what those terms mean. All right, so we're going to also talk about hearing, and then taste and smell will be together, and then touch and pain will be together. So we're at a pretty good stopping place now. Let's take a break till the top of the hour. So I have, that'll be 9 minutes. Let's take a break. If you want to, you can, fill in other things on your form. On your note-taking guide, or take a break, and I will see you back here at straight up 2:00. All right, welcome back, everybody. Let's keep talking about the sensory system. All this is from chapter 2, and we're going to go in and talk about the hearing system. So, what do you think the purpose of the auditory or the hearing system is? Why do we have that system?
Communication and then also just safety and awareness.
Very good, very good. I was thinking that if somebody didn't read the chapter, that you might just think of one or the other, but they're both important there. So safety and social interaction. I was thinking when I was reviewing for this session, I was thinking, I really think maybe there's another thing that's there. It might be also, but maybe this is under either of those two categories, but asking for like getting what we need. Like, or like if you have a headache and you need someone to help you, or you need medicine, or you're a baby and you need a diaper change, you're going to cry. I guess that's kind of safety and social interaction, but lots of functions of our being able to hear and people around us being able to hear. Now, that's not to say if somebody is hearing impaired that they aren't able to survive or aren't able to socially interact or aren't safe. They just have to go about it in a different way. But that's why typically the auditory system is there. So let's go over some terminology. The tympanic membrane. You probably know that is just your eardrum. That's all it is. You can see it in the drawing here. The purpose of it really is to keep stuff from getting into your ear. Right? Now there are 3 bones, and you can see this also in the drawing. There are 3 bones in the middle ear that amplify sound. We know those commonly, and it's okay to keep calling it this, as the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. They have more technical names. The hammer is the malleus, the anvil is the incus, and the stirrup is the stapes. But it's totally fine if you just remember it as the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. You can kind of see, you can see why it was called the stirrup. It's like a little flap that vibrates. So that helps to transmit and amplify noise. Now the cochlea, that's the thing in blue on this drawing. It's often said to look like a snail shell. It's a spiral cavity in the inner ear that produces nerve impulses in response to sound vibrations. So that hammer, anvil, stirrup transmit it and amplify it. They get it to the cochlea, and the cochlea is what really takes those nerve or creates those nerve impulses, and then it transmits them to the brain. Okay. What helps to transmit it is hair receptor cells, little bitty cilia, or tiny hair cells that line the very insides of the ears, and that helps those nerve impulses and noise transmit. So there are 2 main causes of hearing loss, just in the general population. The big front runner is loss of those little hair cells. That's what the vast majority of hearing loss comes from. Now, it also can be something neurological going on. It could be because of from a stroke or cranial nerve damage. Something like that might happen. And of course, there could be things that happen at birth as well. But in the general population, it's usually from loss of those hair cells. Let's move on to taste and smell. Now, the fancy medical terms for these, taste is gustation. That's thought of as the gustatory system. And smell is olfaction or olfactory. Now, what's the only sensory neuron that is continually replaced throughout life? That's your olfactory neurons. So that sets it apart from the other sensory neurons, the neurons that are associated with our other sensations. When we talk about taste, we can't avoid talking about taste buds. So what is that? We've kind of heard that term since probably we were little kids. And I actually remember being taught that there were certain sections of the tongue that the taste buds responded to certain tastes, like sour, salty, sweet. And that actually is not true. Or maybe they just thought it. I mean, I remember learning that in like a first grade class, and I don't think the teacher was lying. I think we have learned better since then that the taste buds, the sensory cells that are on the taste buds are mixed. So you might, you can put something sour in a different part of the tongue and you will taste it. It's not like you won't taste it. So we have anywhere from 5 to 10,000 taste buds. And each of those has 50 to 100 sensory cells. So little bitty cells on each taste bud. And the sensory cells detect one of 5 types of taste. And so we know those to be sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and savory. So it depends what kind of sensory cell is or cells are on the taste bud. But a lot of times there's a mix of those cells on the taste bud. So it's not like one taste bud only detects sour, one only detects sweet. It's not that organized. Which is good because if something gets damaged, there are others that can take over. Now, the cranial nerves that are associated with taste and smell, the cranial nerves we just talked about, on old Olympus top, that's the facial, the glossopharyngeal, and the vagus. All right, put that in the chat in case you wanted to, that can be tricky to spell. So those are the ones that are associated with taste and smell. So if somebody had damage to that for whatever reason, illness, injury, anything, they are going to have an alteration to their taste and smell. Now, it also can happen that they have issues, some kind of damage to the areas of the brain that process that. So in their sensory cortex. They could also have problems, and that could also reduce their ability to taste and smell, or it might make them overly sensitive to that. All right, let me see what else is on your sheet here that you might need to fill in. The olfactory, the main parts of the area associated with smell, well, obviously the olfactory cortex. So the olfactory lobe in the cortex. That detects odor, and it also helps us to distinguish the odor. It's in the temporal lobe. So it's, in the lobe on one side and then the other side above your ear. There's a lot of sensory stuff going on in those temporal lobes. Olfaction is one of the most complex parts of that system because it's linked to memory. Now, you all know this in a functional practical way, think about if you suddenly smell baked bread, or think about a recipe that maybe your grandparent or a parent or a loved one, or just that was really, really tasty. And you smell that, it's going to take you back to that time or make you think about that person or the place you usually ate it. And so it associates then with memories and also with emotions. So what else is in that area is the limbic system, which we'll learn about that here pretty soon, but it is the storage of your emotions. And so it links to memory and to emotion, so that it brings back things to you through that sense of smell. I mean, you might have always heard that if you're trying to sell your house, you should bake cookies, because that scent kind of lingers in the air, and I don't know anybody that doesn't associate that with like happiness and maybe childhood or security or warmth or fun or something good. I know no one that associates the smell of cookies with something bad. There may be somebody out there, but I don't know them. And so, I like to think, if I was going to sell my house, I might cook bacon in it, because I think bacon also is a good smell that people associate, but maybe not everybody. But so that's kind of how you can remember. It's a big deal. It's a complicated thing in the brain. It's not just as straightforward as you might think it might be. Now, the olfactory bulb, you have one for each nostril. It's the connector between your nose hole, and the brain. So it is an actual bulb that processes smell information and then transmits it to the olfactory lobe in the brain, in that temporal lobe.
So what was the term for the detects odor and distinguishes in temporal lobe above ear? That's a
Wait a minute, I'm looking on the word.
olfactory cortex. It was not on there, so I was.
Oh, okay. Yes. Sorry. Olfactory. Yep. Which is in the temporal lobe. So we know about the olfactory bulb, and as people age, I don't know if you guys know anybody that you've known well enough to notice that this is happening, but just over the course of life, people tend to have a decrease in their taste and smell. And it may be that, some damage or something happens to some of their taste buds, but also just the aging process in the olfactory lobe causes some of those cells to die off. And so your sense of smell gets decreased also over time. Sometimes older people will do things like start using excessive salt. Occasionally they'll go to like spicy, like I want buffalo hot wings all the time kind of thing. But a lot of times they'll go towards salty foods, which is not good for them overall. It dehydrates them. It can affect their blood pressure, their heart rate, all of that. So that can be problematic and something that you might see if you work with older adults. All right, so let's move on to touch and pain. Now, this is what we think of as the somatosensory system, or the tactile system. That's responsible for all touch sensations. Now, pain is one of those touch sensations. It's just a big, important one, which is why I listed it separately. But other ones besides pain, other types of touch sensations are light touch, like somebody kind of scratches your back or tickles you with a feather. Pressure, like a deep massage. Vibration. Texture, which is, if you think of it, it's like the difference in that is what you're actually feeling. And then itch, which is really close to pain, especially in some situations. The main areas involved in the brain involved with touch are the thalamus and the somatosensory cortex. So there's a little cortex for each of the things we're talking about here, but let me tell you about a term. You might have seen this before, that it has to do with what we think of as cortical mapping, or it's a topographical map. It's a representation that we can look at that helps us to associate what part of that somatosensory or tactile system in the brain is associated with what on the body. So here's what that looks like. This is actually called the homunculus, which is a $10 word for sure. So the homunculus is this person looking representation here. It's like a chopped up, kind of stretched out body, I guess. But the reason that's like that, so here we have the somatosensory cortex, that's touch sensation, right? Now, just as a preview here, because we're going to talk about this pretty soon, you have the motor cortex, and that's kind of the opposite, I guess, or the partner of the somatosensory, touch and movement, tactile and action. So each of these things are represented in each of these cortices. So if we're just talking about the somatosensory right now, you can look at that. If you have a toothache there, that's the part of your somatosensory cortex that probably is detecting that and saying, ow, call the dentist. If you have something in your eye, if you have a paper cut, if you have a headache, if someone kicks you in the knee, it's this area of your touch or tactile cortex that is going to light up. So that's what a homunculus is. It's a topographical, it's a map of the brain essentially that helps us link or figure out the sensation and where that goes to the body, and the movement and where that goes to the body. Now, 2-point discrimination is just really like it sounds. It's when two things are touched at once that are not right up together, and the person can identify that as 2 points. So you might define it as the minimum distance that it takes for somebody to notice that there are 2 points that they're being touched on, not just one. So if I poke you with 2 fingers like that, or my whole hand, then you're going to feel that as one thing. You know, it's hard to tell where that stops and starts, or 2 individual. But if I touch you like this, or if I, poke you with a stick and then put a Band-Aid on you over here, you're going to feel both of those things. So that's what 2-point discrimination is. That somatosensory system is sophisticated enough that it can tell not just that you're being felt or touched, but where and if it's more than one. Now, your acuity, or let's say your ability to detect those 2 points, is greatest where there are the most nerve endings. So your fingers, your feet, your lips. Where you have more spread out nerve endings, like your back, for example, that's your ability to distinguish those 2-point stuff is going to be further apart. What is the primary function of pain? Well, we've kind of talked about this with the other sensory systems, so I'll just answer it here to keep us moving forward. It's for survival and safety. Because pain it's sensory, but it links to the limbic system. So it links to the center where we keep emotions in our brain. So if we know if it's just a little bit of hurt, or if it's a lot, or it's the worst pain we've ever felt in our lives, we can kind of associate with that other events or other reactions, or even like what help to seek or what medicine to take. So some terms there that are associated: the nociceptors, those are the sensory fibers that detect pain specifically. It's not just someone's touching my eye, it's that someone's poking me in the eye. That's the nociceptors. And you might hear the term nociception, that means pain. Now, allodynia, that's a condition. Really, we think of it as like an abnormal condition that happens when light touch causes pain. And I'm not talking about like tickling somebody until they wet their pants, like that kind of thing. I'm talking about like if somebody has a big time sunburn, or maybe they have been burned and if you barely, if you just real gently touch them, even that can invoke pain there. Neuropathic pain comes from usually disease like diabetes, and it's a malfunction of the nervous system that makes the person feel pins and needles or have distorted feeling. So you probably have heard diabetic neuropathy. That's when the nerves in the hands and feet are damaged over time from too high blood glucose levels, abnormal blood sugar levels, and that damages the nerves in the hands and feet so that sensation is impacted for the worse. Endorphins are opioids, so that is a neurochemical produced by the body that can override pain. We've probably all heard stories or seen, the movie of the week, or I like to read that like drama in real life feature in Reader's Digest. There's a nerd alert for you. But there's always stories in there about someone who, was in a terrible car wreck, but they got out and were able to save the other passengers in the car, even though their arm was broken or something. It was the endorphins that overrode that nociception, the pain detection, because for survival. So that is what you need to know, and kind of the highlights from the book on all your sensory systems that we are learning about today. Now we're getting to the blog post assignment, but I want to exit out of this and also that. One second. And I want to show you a little video of, you guys might have seen something like this before, but we talked about the cochlea, and that's really where the hearing sensation is turned into nerve impulses. So it's very, very important in that complex auditory system. And so sometimes due to aging, due to other nerve problems or developmental problems at birth, someone may have damage or complete loss of function of their cochlea. And now in the last 20 years, the cochlear implants have become more and more commonplace. And so I want you to, and they're an implant that is put actually onto the outer surface of the brain and then wired up so that it creates those signals from noises. And oftentimes, whether they're babies or older people, they'll get them surgically implanted, then they have to wait a certain amount of time, and then they go and the devices get turned on. And so that oftentimes is the first time somebody's maybe ever been able to hear, or the first time they've heard in a long time. So let's watch this little video.
Using a microphone, same way a hearing aid does, but then instead of just amplifying that sound through a speaker the way a hearing aid would, it processes the sound, breaks it into different frequencies, and then electrically stimulates parts of the cochlear nerve to bring sound into a person who couldn't otherwise hear. Candidate for a cochlear implant is really someone who can't hear well enough despite using traditional hearing aids that have been tuned the best that they can For kids, it's difficult because we can't use sentence testing. So we rely on special tests designed to help determine if a small child can hear or not. What was unusual in Sarah's case was that she had normal hearing and language before she started to lose it later in her childhood. So her brain, her auditory nervous system was already pre-wired to receive sound from a cochlear implant.
She wore hearing aids for a number of years and did very well with hearing aids, but as her hearing loss progressed, the hearing aids became less and less useful for her, and the compensation that they gave her was less. So the cochlear implant became the next step.
When we first heard about the recommendation for cochlear implants, we were very nervous and scared. But then after talking with Dr. Bowditch and his explanation of everything, it really calmed us, and we knew that that was the direction we wanted to go. It was really nice how we were all able to be with Sarah right beforehand. Even on the way to the operating room, they had an iPad where she was playing games on an iPad, so she was totally distracted from the impending surgery. And it wasn't until she was asleep that they administered any IVs or anything of that nature. That was nice to know that she wasn't scared or anything like that whatsoever.
Cochlear implants don't provide an instant cure to hearing loss. Cochlear implants require a long period of learning to listen again. This starts with the surgery, and that is done as an outpatient procedure, done right here at the hospital. But then we follow up with the patient both from audiology and rehab perspectives to help develop those skills that they're going to use with the cochlear implant.
Of course, I'm biased about Johns Hopkins. I've worked here for years. I've been a patient here and I've had excellent care. But I think that we do a great job here by working together as a team. We're tightly integrated. We've done thousands of cochlear implant surgeries. We've worked with thousands of families.
Looks like you healed really well there.
To get safe, reliable, effective surgery and cochlear implant programming and auditory rehab therapy to optimize the results that you get with a cochlear implant.
Unstressed words, they're hard to hear. The foundation of academics is listening and language, and we have to ensure that those skills are strong. Kathy Leonard has been wonderful. She's been with us even before the surgery, helping us with the school and getting the proper support that Sarah's needed. She's even gone and attended school meetings with me in Sarah's behalf, and has just been, I can't even describe, she's just been absolutely wonderful.
We're lucky here at Johns Hopkins that we have put together a comprehensive team that we call the Listening Center, which includes audiologists, otologists, rehab therapists, and a group from our behavioral psychology team.
When we were referred to Hopkins, I mean, there was no need to search, in my opinion, and her father's for another hospital. I mean, Hopkins is the best. It gave us comfort knowing she was in the best hands possible.
When you go through all the appointments and surgery, it's worth it so you can hear and understand everybody instead of being a person left out.
Everyone's been so supportive, and we've gotten so much help. It's made the experience much better in that we could focus just on Sarah and her recovery.
It helps for me to hear better. I almost hear everything my friend is saying, even though I like texting more than calling on the phone.
All right. So maybe that can even help with our understanding of the cochlea, is looking at that. All right. I got one more for you, and then I'm going to set you free with the blog post. Close all that down. All right. Optical illusions in how we see.
I want to start with a game, okay? And to win this game, all you have to do is see the reality that's in front of you as it really is, all right? So we have two panels here of colored dots, and one of those dots is the same in the two panels, okay? And you have to tell me which one. Now I'll narrow it down to the gray one, the green one, and say the orange one. So by a show of hands, we'll start with the easiest one. Show of hands, how many people think it's the gray one? Really? Okay. How many people think it's the green one? And how many people think it's the orange one? So pretty even split. So let's find out what the reality is. Here is the orange one, right? Here's the green one, and here's the gray one. So for all of you saw that, you're complete realists, all right? So this is pretty amazing, actually, isn't it? Because nearly every living system has evolved the ability to detect light in one way or another. So for us, seeing color is one of the simplest things the brain does. And yet, even at this most fundamental level, context is everything. Okay? What I'm going to talk about is not that context is everything, but why is context everything? Because it's answering that question that tells us not only why we see what we do, but who we are as individuals and who we are as a society. But first we have to ask another question, which is, what is color for? And instead of telling you, I'll just show you. What you see here is a jungle scene, and you see the surfaces according to the amount of light that those surfaces reflect. Now, can any of you see the predator that's about to jump out at you? And if you haven't seen it yet, you're dead, right? Can anyone see it? Anyone? No? Now let's see the surfaces according to the quality of light that they reflect. And now you see it, right? So color enables us to see the similarities and differences between surfaces according to the full spectrum of light that they reflect. But what you've just done is in many respects mathematically impossible. Why? Because as Berkeley tells us, we have no direct access to our physical world other than through our senses. And the light that falls onto our eyes is determined by multiple things in the world, not only the color of objects, but also the color of their illumination and the color of the space between us and those objects. You vary any one of those parameters and you'll change the color of the light that falls onto your eye. This is a huge problem because it means that the same image could have an infinite number of possible real-world sources. So let me show you what I mean. Imagine that this is the back of your eye. Okay? And these are two projections from the world. They're identical in every single way. Identical in shape, size, spectral content. They are the same as far as your eye is concerned. And yet they come from completely different sources. The one on the right comes from a yellow surface in shadow, oriented facing the left, viewed through a pinkish medium. The one on the left comes from an orange surface under direct light, facing to the right, viewed through a sort of a bluish medium. Completely different meanings, giving rise to the exact same retinal information. And yet it's only the retinal information that we get. So how on earth do we even see? So if you remember anything in this next 18 minutes, remember this, that the light that falls onto your eye, sensory information, is meaningless. Because it could mean literally anything. And what's true for sensory information is true for information generally. There's no inherent meaning in information. It's what we do with that information that matters. So how do we see? Well, we see by learning to see. So the brain evolved the mechanisms for finding patterns, finding relationships in information, and associating those relationships with a behavioral meaning, a significance, by interacting with the world. We're very aware of this in the form of more cognitive attributes like language. So I'm going to give you some letter strings and I want you to read them out for me if you can. What are you reading? Half the letters are missing, right? There's no a priori reason why an H has to go between that W and A, but you put one there. Why? Because in the statistics of your past experience, it would have been useful to do so. So you do so again. And yet you don't put a letter after that first T. Why? Because it wouldn't have been useful in the past. So you don't do it again. So let me show you how quickly our brains can redefine normality, even at the simplest thing the brain does, which is color. So if I could have the lights down up here, I want you to first notice that those two desert scenes are physically the same. One is simply the flipping of the other, okay? Now I want you to look at that dot between the green and the red, okay? And I want you to just stare at that dot. Don't look anywhere else. And we're gonna look at that for about 30 seconds, which is a bit of a killer in an 18-minute talk. Okay, but I really want you to learn. And I'll tell you, don't look anywhere else. And I'll tell you what's happening inside your head. Your brain is learning, and it's learning that the right side of its visual field is under red illumination. The left side of its visual field is under green illumination. That's what it's learning. Okay, now, when I tell you, I want you to look at the dot between the two desert scenes. So why don't you do that now? Can we have the lights up again? So I take it from your response, they don't look the same anymore, right? Why? Because your brain is seeing that same information as if the right one is still under red light and the left one is still under green light. That's your new normal. Okay, so what does this mean for context? It means I can take these two identical squares and I can put them in light and dark surrounds. Now the one on the dark surround looks lighter than the one on the light surround. What's significant is not simply the light and dark surrounds that matter. It's what those light and dark surrounds meant for your behavior in the past. So I'll show you what I mean. Here we have that exact same illusion. We have two identical tiles on the left, one in a dark surround, one in a light surround, and the same thing over on the right. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to reveal those two scenes, but I'm not going to change anything within those boxes except their meaning and see what happens to your perception. Notice that on the left, the two tiles look nearly completely opposite, one very white and one very dark, right? Whereas on the right, the two tiles look nearly the same. And yet there is still one in a dark surround and one in a light surround. Why? Because if the tile in that shadow were in fact in shadow and reflecting the same amount of light to your eye as the one outside the shadow, it would have to be more reflective, just the laws of physics. So you see it that way. Whereas on the right, the information is consistent with those two tiles being under the same light. If they're under the same light, reflecting the same amount of light to your eye, then they must be equally reflective. So you see it that way. Which means we can bring all this information together to create some incredibly strong illusions. This is one I made a few years ago. And you'll notice you see a dark brown tile at the top and a bright orange tile at the side. That is your perceptual reality. The physical reality is that those two tiles are the same. Here you see 4 gray tiles on your left, 7 gray tiles on the right. I'm not going to change those tiles at all, but I'm going to reveal the rest of the scene and see what happens to your perception. The 4 blue tiles on the left are gray. The 7 yellow tiles on the right are also gray. They are the same, okay? Don't believe me? Let's watch it again. What's true for color is also true for complex perceptions of motion. So here we have, let's turn this around, a diamond. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold it here and I'm going to spin it. And for all of you, you'll see it probably spinning this direction. Now I want you to keep looking at it, move your eyes around, blink, maybe close one eye, and suddenly it'll flip and start spinning the opposite direction. Yes, raise your hand if you got that. Yes, keep blinking. Every time you blink, it'll switch, right? So I can ask you, which direction is it rotating? How do you know? Your brain doesn't know because both are equally likely. So depending on where it looks, it flips between the two possibilities. Are we the only ones that see illusions? The answer to this question is no. Even the beautiful bumblebee with its mere 1 million brain cells, which is 250 times fewer cells than you have one retina, sees illusions. Does the most complicated things that even our most sophisticated computers can't do. So in my lab, we of course work on bumblebees because we can completely control their experience and see how that alters the architecture of their brain. And we do this in what we call the bee matrix. And here you have the hive. You can see the queen bee, that large bee in the middle there. Those are all her daughters, the eggs. And they go back and forth between this hive and the arena via this tube. And you'll see one of the bees come out here. You see she has a little number on her? Yeah, there's another one coming out. She also has a number on her. Now they're not born that way, right? We pull them out, put them in the fridge, and they fall asleep, and then you can super glue little numbers on them, right? And now in this experiment, they get a reward if they go to the blue flowers, okay? And they land on the flower, they stick their tongue in there, called the proboscis, and they drink sugar water. Now she's drinking a glass of water, it's about that big to you and I. will do that about 3 times and then fly, right? And sometimes they learn not to go to the blue, but to go to where the other bees go. So they copy each other. They can count to 5. They can recognize faces. And here she comes down the ladder, and she'll come into the hive, find an empty honey pot, and throw up. And that's honey. Okay? Now remember, she's supposed to be going to the blue flowers, but what are these bees doing in the upper right corner? It looks like they're going to green flowers. Now, are they getting it wrong? And the answer to the question is no. Those are actually blue flowers, but those are blue flowers under green light. So they're using the relationships between the colors to solve the puzzle, which is exactly what we do. So illusions are often used, especially in art, in the words of a more contemporary artist, to demonstrate the fragility of our senses. Okay, this is complete rubbish. Okay, the senses aren't fragile. If they were, we wouldn't be here. Okay, instead, color tells us something completely different, that the brain didn't actually evolve to see the world the way it is. We can't. Instead, the brain evolved to see the world the way it was useful to see in the past. And how we see is by continually redefining normality. So how can we take this incredible capacity of plasticity of the brain and get people to experience their world differently? Well, one of the ways we do in my lab and studio is we translate the light into sound, and we enable people to hear their visual world, okay? And they can navigate the world using their ears. Here's David in the right, and he's holding a camera. On the left is what his camera sees, and you'll see there's a line, a faint line going across that image. That line is broken up into 32 squares. And each square, we calculate the average color, and then we just simply translate that into sound. And now he's going to turn around, close his eyes, and find a plate on the ground with his eyes closed. He finds it. Amazing, right? So not only can we create a prosthetic for the visually impaired, but we can also investigate how people literally make sense of the world. But we can also do something else. We can also make music with color. So working with kids, they created images, thinking about what might the images you see sound like if we could listen to them. And then we translated these images. And this is one of those images. And this is a 6-year-old child composing a piece of music for a 32-piece orchestra. And this is what it sounds like. So a 6-year-old child, okay? Now, what does all this mean? What this suggests is that no one is an outside observer of nature, okay? We're not defined by our essential properties, by the bits that make us up. We're defined by our environment and our interaction with that environment, by ecology. And that ecology is necessarily relative, historical, and empirical, right? So what I'd like to finish with is this over here, because what I've been trying to do is really celebrate uncertainty, because I think only through uncertainty is there potential for understanding. So if some of you are still feeling a bit too certain, I'd like to do this one. So if we have the lights down, and what we have here, can everyone see 25 purple surfaces on your left and 25, call it yellowish surfaces on your right? So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to put the middle 9 surfaces here under yellow illumination by simply putting a filter behind them. All right. Now you can see that changes the light that's coming through there, right? Because now the light's going through a yellowish filter and then a purplish filter. And I'm going to do this opposite on the left here. I'm going to put the middle 9 under a purplish light, okay? Now, some of you have noticed that the consequence is that the light coming through those middle 9 on the right, or your left, is exactly the same as the light coming through the middle 9 on your right. Agreed? Yes? Okay, so they are physically the same. Let's pull the covers off. Now remember, you know that the middle 9 are exactly the same. Do they look the same? No. Question is that an illusion? And I'll leave you with that. So thank you very much.
All right. So I think that stuff is so interesting. And it's kind of been out there in the media lately with the, seeing things of different colors, depending on how it happens to hit you. All right, so let's go back, and if you are under today's course content folder, all of those videos are available. The Kahoot is available. Here is the blog post. So I wanted to point out there's only a couple of them in this course, so I didn't put it under assignments. I did that last year and it seemed like it confused people because I really just want you to do it in class. Spend about the next 15-ish minutes. It may take you a little longer, but it's due by midnight tonight. So what I want you to do is to write just a couple of paragraphs, 1 to 2 paragraphs. First, you're going to read an article. What's up with the dress that looks like it's different color to different people? And then go to this page and pick one of the links. One of the audio casts. So if you do that, it's going to take you to this page. And I want you to just pick one of these and listen to it. And then you're going to write up 1 to 2 paragraph blog post based on those 2 pieces of information, the article and what you listened to. Just answering the question, what was your takeaway? What surprised you? What do you think was interesting? Something like that. All right, so we're going to all log off, but you will have until midnight tonight to get that submitted. You submit it right here under today's course content folder. Any questions or anything for me before we sign off for the week? All right, we meet again on Monday. So I will see y'all after the weekend. Have a happy, healthy, fulfilling weekend. And I look forward to seeing you Monday. Bye, everybody.